Introduction, Part 5. The Amazonian Rainforest and the Balance of Trade. I don't like to point this out to you, but John Maynard Keynes based his ideas upon those of an obscure book by Hobson and Mummery, the ideology of which is to prevent individuals saving capital by taking it off them in taxes if they do. These ideas of political economy are manifest within the tax system of 2024 and have been ever since Keynes's diatribe infiltrated the collective consciousness of people who create governmental policies about taxation. As a consequence of Keynes, the majority of modern economists have anxious ideas about money gravitating towards the location of where stock is. They call this the balance of trade. How much money leaves the nation through importation to that nation, and how much money enters the country through exportation from that country. I say these ideas are misfounded and have caused the destruction of the Amazonian rainforest. I paraphrase from Wealth of Nations, Book 4, Chapter 2, of Restraint upon Importation. When the necessaries of life have become taxed in any country, it becomes proper, some people pretend, to tax not only the like necessaries of life imported from other countries, but all sorts of foreign goods which can come into competition with anything that is the produce of domestic industry. Subsistence, these people say, becomes necessarily dearer in consequence of such taxes. Such taxes as taxes upon domestically produced commodities. They, in Adam Smith's time, have understood this one correctly. And the price of labour must always rise with the price of the labourer's subsistence. Again, this statement is true. Every commodity, therefore, which is the produce of domestic industry, though not immediately taxed itself, becomes dearer in consequence of such taxes, because the labour which produces it becomes so. True again, though this is really not readily perceived by policymakers today, i.e., as the cost of living rises, so does the cost of labour, because this increase in the cost of living, which is the result of taxes upon produced commodities, has to be passed on to the price at which all domestically produced commodities are sold. Note that domestic labour is required to produce domestically produced commodities. Smith was talking about inflation before the word was invented. In order to put domestic upon the same footing with foreign industry, therefore, it becomes necessary, the misguided people think, to lay some duty, which is a taxation, upon every foreign commodity, equal to this enhancement of the price of the home commodities with which it can come into competition, i.e., the misguided people have built a monetary house of cards upon the following proposition, which is the likes of malt tariffs on domestically produced malt causes inflation, which is bad for all domestic industry. So, the misguided people think to counteract this, the government should increase its revenues by increasing duties on everything imported from abroad wine, candles, silk, cotton, silver, etc. But in truth, this increases the price of living further, as vineyards in Scotland are not as favourably climatized as those in France, and so people of Scotland are prevented from buying French wine, most probably of a superior quality, at its cheaper price. When the price of living increases, this has the most visible effect of requiring the government to pay a higher amount of individual wages to public servants to meet this price of living increase, which requires more revenues, which, if not in the form as PET, personal expenditure tax, increase the price of living further. This is a vicious circle. Further, individuals can save less when the price of living is higher, resulting in fewer savings. Hence less capital gains. Hence less money to invest in stock. Hence both fewer people employed by working upon this stock. This is what unemployment is. And also, as a consequence of this reduction in stock, failure of competition, impaired markets, and larger firms buying out or outcompeting smaller enterprises, which is a parody of and a perversion of the way the world ought to be. In the Victorian era, the poet Stephen Crane wrote, God fashioned the ship of the world carefully, with the infinite skill of an all-master. Made he the hull and the sails, held he the rudder ready for adjustment. Erect stood he, scanning his work proudly. Then, at fateful time, a wrong called, and God turned, heeding. Lo, the ship, at this opportunity, slipped slyly, making cunning noiseless travel down the ways, so that, forever rudderless, it went upon the seas, going ridiculous voyages, making quaint progress, turning, as with serious purpose, before stupid winds. and there were many in the sky who laughed at this thing. I now quote from Wealth of Nations, Book 4, Chapter 3, Part 2. When two places trade with one another, this doctrine, end quote, of the balance of trade, quote, supposes that if the balance be even, neither of them loses or gains. But if it leans in any degree to one side, that one of them loses and the other gains in proportion to its declension from the exact equilibrium. Both suppositions are false. End quote. I quote, nothing, however, can be more absurd than this whole doctrine of the balance of trade, upon which not only these restraints, but almost all the other regulations of commerce are founded. End quote. Those restraints being the extraordinary restraints laid upon the importation of goods from other countries with which the balance of trade is supposed to be disadvantageous. The following is true. I quote, if the balance be even, and if the trade between the two places consist altogether in the exchange of their native commodities, they will, upon most occasions, not only both gain, but they will gain equally, or very nearly equally. Each will, in this case, afford a market for a part of the surplus produce of the other. Each will replace a capital which had been employed in raising and preparing for the market this part of the surplus produce of the other, and which had been distributed among and given revenue and maintenance to a certain number of its inhabitants. End quote. Recall that capital is material tangible stuff, or, in the form of money, it is the worth of the money, i.e., the amount of material tangible stuff the money will exchange by. Let us just say 17% of the Scotch production of whisky is exported exclusively to France, which in turn exports 41% of its wine production exclusively to Scotland, and that this 17% of whiskey will exchange for the same amount of stuff that 41% of the wine production of France will exchange for. This 17% of the production of Scotch whisky, which is exported from Scotland, does not find a home market within Scotland because the Scottish population have only a requirement for the purchase and consumption of a finite number of gallons of whisky each year. This is called the absolute demand. It is what they would like to have. They may wish to have no more than this. If I have 6 suits in my wardrobe and somebody offers me a high quality suit on discount, I may wish to buy it because it's of better quality than my existing suits. But if the suit on offered is of the same quality, I'm likely to say, sorry, but I already have 6 suits and I have no space for one more. The same is true pertaining to the home market by the consumption of whisky in Scotland, and the home market by the consumption of wine within France. The home market may require, if it can afford to buy, and assuming it can afford to buy, so much and no more whisky or wine. Obviously, wine is not produced in Scotland due to climate reasons, so it must be imported to Scotland instead. Without this exchange of actual commodities between France and Scotland, there would be less industry performed in France, less stock upon which the industry is performed, more unemployment, and less gold would be attracted to this non-augmented industry, where industry is work or meaningful labour. Scottish people, having a demand for wine, would not be able to get hold of it, thus creating a market for, perhaps, smugglers to smuggle this wine as contraband to Scotland. And the French, deprived of their natural liberty, would be unable to acquire Scotch whisky, and this in turn would deprive Scotland from being able to augment its stock in provisions, materials, and finished goods pertaining to the whisky industry. Thus their industry would be non-augmented, and money being less attracted to this non-augmented industry within Scotland would flow out of Scotland as foreign investments become apparent and more lucrative elsewhere. Let me repeat these last words I quoted from Book 4, Chapter 3, Part 2. Each place will replace a capital which had been employed in raising and preparing for the market this part of the surplus produce of the other, and which had been distributed among, and given revenue and maintenance to, a certain number of its inhabitants. End quote. Given revenue to. the wages people in the Scotch whisky industry get paid affords them clothes, affords them houses, and affords them the ability, or it ought to save, to generate their own worth of money, which can be used as capital within their own enterprises. I quote, "Some part of the inhabitants of each, therefore, will directly derive their revenue and maintenance from the other," end quote, i.e., the workers within the Scotch whisky industry will derive their capabilities to acquire the necessaries and luxuries of the price of living by the consumption within France of 17% of the total production of whisky within Scotland. Adam Smith continued, "As the commodities exchanged, too, are supposed to be of equal value, so the two capitals employed in the trade will, upon most occasions, be equal or very nearly equal, and both being employed in raising the native commodities of the two countries, the revenue and maintenance which their distribution will afford to the inhabitants of each will be equal, or very nearly equal. This revenue and maintenance, thus mutually afforded, will be greater or smaller in proportion to the extent of their dealings. If these should annually amount to £100,000, for example, or to 1 millions on each side, each of them will afford an annual revenue in the one case of £100,000 and in the other of £1 million to the inhabitants of the other." End quote. As an aside, the expression 1 millions, where millions is in plural, was the correct way of speaking back then.